Since the emergence of the COVID-19 pandemic, South Africa has been forced to redirect its resources to meet the needs of citizens who already face harsh economic conditions. But has the government conveniently used this as an excuse to marginalize refugees, asylum seekers and foreign workers in the country? Dr. Stephen Gordon of the Human Sciences Research Council recently did a presentation on this subject. He joins us now to tell us a little bit more. Dr. Stephen, good evening and thank you very much for your time. This presentation was done in light of a webinar which was held to commemorate World Refugee Day, which was this past Sunday, the 20th. Right now, if we look at how countries the world over have responded to this pandemic, many countries have closed their borders to manage the infections, but also have redirected some of the scarce natural resources to meet the needs of their citizens which have been affected by the lockdown. What does that action, right, mean as far as the global implication for all countries, but particularly for South Africa, to fulfill its mandate to fight xenophobia?
Well, thank you very much for speaking on this very important topic of anti-refugee and anti-foreigner sentiment, not only in South Africa, but in many parts of the world. So beginning in early 2020, we saw widespread lockdowns, not only in South Africa, but in a variety of different nations across the globe. We also saw a rise in xenophobic rhetoric, both in the United States, but also in India, England, Germany, France, and a range of other countries. By comparison, South Africa has done remarkably well on this issue. We must remember that anti-immigrant and anti-foreigner sentiment in our country is unfortunately quite high. Successive public opinion polls show that many people falsely blame refugees and foreigners for a variety of the country's ills, including crime, unemployment, sexual depravity, and drugs. Now, the government has been much more responsible than many of its counterparts in not perpetuating anti-immigrant sentiment during this very difficult and traumatic time. We, as the Human Sciences Research Council, conducted a study interviewing people right before the hard lockdown in March 25th, 2020, and then after the most severe lockdowns ended in October of 2020. These two waves, we looked at anti-immigration sentiment. Now, anti-immigration sentiment was quite high before the lockdown period and remained so after the lockdown period. What was interesting was the lack of movement on this variable. So while the last year of panic, economic scarcity, and disease has certainly not improved xenophobia within our nation, there is no evidence right now that the problem has been exacerbated. However,
so you're saying, Dr. Stephen, sorry, let me come in there. You're saying the culture of solidarity and compassion has prevailed even with the shrinking tax base and economic benefits?
There are many people in South Africa who hold strong anti-immigrant views. Thankfully, we have not seen their numbers expand significantly during this recent period. This gives us hope that if significant resources are mobilized to counter the threats of xenophobia, we can make real and meaningful progress. Some of the issues that could really help fight xenophobia in our country include targeted messaging campaigns, but perhaps the single most progressive solution to this problem would be real and meaningful immigrant and refugee integration reform. South Africa lacks an adequate integration program as recognized by international standards. We can benefit from learning what other countries have done in this process to create meaningful integration programs that will benefit our country, both economically, but also culturally. We have a real opportunity here to use immigration as a tool to rebuild after the tragedies of the 2020 pandemic. And we should not see immigration as a threat, but rather as an opportunity for economic and social growth.
Now, the question of crime, there's some portion of society that believe that refugees, for example, are linked to a high rise in crime in South Africa. What's the public attitude on the question of crime?
Unfortunately, a large percentage of our country seems to believe that refugees are a major source of crime. It's unfortunately more than half of the adult population that we have surveyed. I must stress at this stage that there is no truth to this false stereotype. Many people hold false information about refugees and asylum seekers. They view them as dishonest, as violent, as job stealers. But the vast majority of refugees and asylum seekers are ordinary people looking to restart their lives after quite traumatic circumstances in their home country. They are not a source of crime, nor a significant drain on state resources, despite some of the clickbait news you may see on social media.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you that question, Dr. Stephen. What is driving the narrative on refugees in South Africa? Where is the most influence in terms of how the public then gets its attitude?
You know, we asked people, in order to answer this question, we asked people in our survey, what is the most trusted source of information you have on refugees? And we found that the majority of the population listed the broadcast media as the most significant source of information on this topic. The broadcast media was listed by 65% of the population surveyed, with radio listed by 50%, television listed by 65%. The internet had a far lower level of trust, many people not trusting the internet to provide credible information on this issue, only 10% saying that the internet provided a trustworthy source of information on refugees in South Africa. This shows us which news channels and which news medium can be used to push back against many of the false narratives in our society. You know, the broadcast media has a responsibility to push back on many false claims that people make. Take a very simple example. There are, as stats say, and credible demographers will tell you, probably less than 3 million foreign-born persons living in South Africa at any given time. There are only about 280,000 people seeking or having acquired political asylum within the country. However, if you ask people how many foreigners reside within our nation, they will list tens of millions of persons. A truly outlandish number, but an outlandish number you see quoted sometimes by our politicians and political leaders. So it is these kind of dangerous narratives about the destructive nature of immigration that the broadcast media can push back on to have a meaningful impact on reducing xenophobia in South Africa.
And maybe as a final question, is there demographic information or regional information that comes up as far as areas in South Africa and how those attitudes are influenced?
Well, we at the Human Science Research Council have been running a series of surveys on this very important issue. So we conduct large public opinion surveys, the most prominent of which is the South African Social Attitude Survey, SASAS. And this is done every year in all 9 provinces and provides a great benchmark which measures anti-immigrant attitudes. We speak to old and young, rich and poor, black and white, to get a truly comprehensive picture of this problem. And I just want to say that while we may scapegoat a particular group of people as being xenophobic, we must, all of us, remember that this is not a problem of just one group of people. Old and young people exhibit xenophobic attitudes. Rich and poor harbor negative attitudes towards refugees and migrants. This is not a problem of just one race group. This is a problem that we see evident in all race groups in South Africa. So I would caution against stigmatizing one group of South Africans as particularly xenophobic. This is a problem that affects the country as a whole, and we need to approach it holistically.
Dr. Stephen Gordon, I appreciate your time. Thank you very much for joining us tonight and sharing this presentation with us and some of the findings around this very important question on how South Africa is responding to the question of refugees in this time of a shrinking tax base and the scramble for scarce resources.